Hi everybody, welcome back to this very special edition of Lifting the Lamp. The reason why I've chosen to make this video tonight is because a huge bit of news broke in Australia where I live today. It's a bit of news which represents nothing short of a tectonic shift in the structure of Australian society and will go down as a turning point in history. And I think given the events that are going on in other parts of the world, particularly in the United States at this time, it is a very pertinent issue that I cover tonight. And what is that issue? Well, it has to do with the census results that were just released in Australia, going into detail about what the dominant forms of religion are in Australian society. Now, for all of Australian history from colonisation up until, the present day until now, Australia has been a nominally Christian country. That is to say that a majority of the population was Christian. That's changed now. And at the time the last series of census results were released a few years ago, Christianity was still the majority religion. A majority of Australians still identified as Christian. But the results that were released today shows that number has dropped to just 43.9% of the population. In addition, those who identify as no religion has risen to about 38.9%. And that's huge. That represents a relatively steep decline in the number of people who identify as Christian in Australia and a corresponding incline to the number of people who say they don't identify with a religion at all. And given how much those incline and declines occurred respectively, and given that there's only a margin of about 5% difference between the number of Christians and religious nuns now, we could see in the next few years the number of people identifying with no religion actually overtake the number of Christians in Australia. People who identify as no religion comprise mostly of atheists, but it also includes people who are what you might describe as spiritual but not religious. This is the category that I fit into. Although I was born into a Christian denomination, I later turned my back on the church and chose to identify with no religion and with spiritual beliefs that weren't confined to the doctrines of a particular institution or set of religious authorities. And in doing that, in changing my beliefs in that way, I joined a growing number of people who felt the same way. And as of yesterday, that demographic shift has formally been documented as one which has transformed the nation. So that so many people are turning away from the church now that Christianity can no longer be considered the default religion of Australia anymore. And as we grapple with this change, we will need to start to look at ways of defining ourselves as a nation which are more in line with secular values rather than what one particular holy text has to say about the world and the way that society should be run. Delicious. So I could talk about my personal reasons why I have decided to join the growing number of people who no longer want to identify with Christianity and want to make a point to say that they belong to no religion on the census. I could do an entire playlist about why I left Christianity, all the reasons why, but I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to focus on the broader aspects, the social aspects of this, looking at society as a whole and what other people have observed in terms of social trends among large groups of people that might have contributed to this change. Now, the decline in the number of Christians in Australia is nothing new. It's been happening for the better part of 100 years, maybe even slightly more. But what has become really noticeable in the last, say, 20 or 30 years is that that decline has become steeper. And there are a few reasons that have been identified as the most likely to contributing to the decline in Christianity and the emptying of the churches across the country. The first of these is the advancement of science. As we have learnt more about our world using science and technology and developed theories in physics and elsewhere, we have learnt many things about our universe which have proven that all of the things that religious authorities have said about the universe are just patently untrue. And the fact that these supposed arbiters of authority on all the mysteries of the universe could have got it as wrong as they did has really struck a blow to their credibility. And the ways that science really challenges many of the assumptions and beliefs of Christian people has been brought to bear in a big way since the rise of the new atheist movement around the 2000s going into the 2010s. And the methods and the kind of polemical language that the new atheists used to criticize religion was one-sided and dogmatic in its own way, but it did, in a very ruthless fashion, bring to bear many of the contradictions and shortcomings in the explanations which religion, traditional religion, offered for the way the world works. Another big reason is generational and cultural shifts. So the first kind of development in the decline in the number of Christians in Australia in a way that was steeper than what it was before really began from about 1990 onwards, so about the time that I was born. And a lot of that can be traced, I think, to the countercultural movement in the 60s and 70s. In those times you had a lot of people being attracted to alternative spiritual beliefs and not necessarily continuing on the religion of their parents. And as that generation had children, the sort of hippie generation, if you will, they didn't necessarily pass on the traditional Christian beliefs that they themselves might have been brought up in, or they might have passed on a more liberal form of Christianity. So there was a different type of cultural conditioning that was occurring. And another point that I would make about the generational thing is that people from the younger generations, particularly Generation Y and Gen Z, have a set of values about what they consider to be right and wrong, which is very different to what the traditional hierarchies in the church have to say about society. And so it's not surprising that the biggest number of people who identify as not religious or who don't identify as Christian come from those younger generations. The sort of hardline approach that a lot of religious leaders take when it comes to people exploring other forms of spirituality is also something which has not worked in their favour. This kind of Christian exclusivism, if you're not with me then you're against me kind of mentality. Prohibition on exploring any other kind of spiritual belief outside the church, and if you do so you're a heretic and a sinner. Well, if you do that in an open society where people have the freedom to choose something where they're going to be made to feel more welcome, all you're going to achieve by doing that is driving people away. Another big thing that is responsible for the shift, according to many people, is the changes that occurred in society as a result of the global war on terror and the Bush administration, and the whole narrative that was perpetuated following the 9/11 attacks about the clash of cultures, about Christians versus Muslims, and the Bush administration very much trying to create a sense of a new crusade against the East by the West, based on, the greatness of Christian civilization and the kinds of atrocities that occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of this crusader mentality of the Bush administration, which was very much an administration which had the backing of the evangelical community, and Bush was a very religious president, and so there was a huge connection between what that administration was responsible for and what got most commonly touted as Christian values. And it led to a lot of bigotry and hatred in society as well, particularly against the Muslim community. And much of this occurred in the name of Christianity. And there can be no doubt about that. And echoes of that occurred in Australia. John Howard tried to mimic George W. Bush and the United States in many ways. And so the effects of that cultural shift could be felt here as well. And it did not paint Christianity or the more evangelical churches in a positive light at all for people who are concerned about human rights, about having a tolerant and inclusive society, and a modern society where people weren't judged based upon what part of the world they came from or what religion they followed. And that brings me to the broader point of the perceived influence of church groups and certain denominations or interpretations of Christianity on politics. The fact alone that a particular religion can have such an undue influence on what is supposed to be a secular society is an indictment in its own right. But that's to say nothing of the particular ways that Christian churches have sought to get close to power, to get into the corridors of power and influence leaders of countries like Australia and indeed the US in particular ways, ways which have raised the ire of many people in society, particularly the younger generation that I was speaking of before, the younger generations. In all the areas where generational replacement is occurring, as the older generation dies off and are replenished by this younger generation, these are the people who are becoming more and more, statistically, there are more people in that group who are becoming incensed with the kinds of views they see being promulgated in politics in the name of Christianity. One area where this is very apparent is with the LGBTQIA plus community and the attitudes that many religious leaders have had towards that community. Here in Australia, we have had, up until this year, we had a Liberal government, which actually means a Conservative government, for 9 years, since 2013. And 2 out of the 3 of the leaders of the Liberal Party, who were our Prime Minister, were very religious people. They made a point of talking about how their religion motivated their political convictions. We had Tony Abbott from 2013 to 2015, and after that we briefly had Malcolm Turnbull, and then after that we had Scott Morrison, who won re-election in 2019, and called his election victory a miracle, and was very close to the Hillsong Church, and called himself a leader who was chosen by God and who was put in place to do God's work. Similarly, Tony Abbott before him was a strict Catholic and believed that he was doing God's work by taking the political positions that he took in his parliament, and even thought about becoming a priest before he became a politician. And the thing that these two leaders had in common was that they represented an extreme right agenda politically, and one where they had these weird obsessions with culture wars on particular social issues, such as the way that children were taught about sexuality in schools, and other things about the education system. We saw the introduction of college chaplaincy programs where secular government-funded schools were given college chaplains, even though they weren't religious schools. And so in the education system in particular, there was this pushing of a religious agenda on people who never asked for it, and in a way that was really damaging to the well-being and the mental health of a section of the community who wanted to just be accepted for who they were and were susceptible to trauma based on a denial of their identity. And you had church leaders who were essentially calling them an abomination. And we had these religious prime ministers and their governments interfering in the education system, the public education system, in a way that would only ensure that that unwelcoming environment was reinforced for those children. And of course there was the equal marriage debate. Equal marriage was another huge thing which the Liberal government continuously tried to deny until the public pressure became so intense on them that they washed their hands of it, so to speak, by holding a plebiscite. But that was mainly because the pressure was becoming too much for them, but they didn't want to actually pass legislation to make marriage available to all, because that went against their principles, the principles that drove the hard religious right, which controlled and still does control the Liberal Party. And so these political leaders in Australia convinced themselves that they were doing God's work by engaging in these cultural wars, when in fact the rest of the country had very different attitudes to them, and saw their choice of, the battles that they chose as very bizarre. One of the last things that the outgoing Morrison government tried to do was make controversial statements about trans children, and this was the hill that they chose to die on in an election campaign. So completely out of touch in many people's eyes with what the rest of the country was really concerned about. Issues such as cost of living, inflation, and so on, the management of the pandemic, and they're choosing to obsess over something that only religious people seem to care about. And then, of course, there is the issue of women's rights. Now, Australia is a very similar kind of society to the US, and many of these mainstream conservative churches have much the same opinion on reproductive rights as their counterparts in the United States do. So it is a phenomenon here as well, but that religio-political force is nowhere near as serious in Australia as it is in America. But there is the same disconnect between what mainstream religious figures from Christian denominations, from many Christian denominations, not all, but many, have to say about issues of reproductive rights, and what the rest of the country, or much of the country, particularly the women of the country, have to say about it. And needless to say, that has alienated a lot of people from the churches as well. But recent events in Australia can be seen as somewhat prophetic, I think, because the same trend is occurring in the United States as in Australia. It hasn't reached the same level of development as it has here in Australia, but it's only a matter of time, given that many of the cultural differences between the churches, many of the mainstream churches and the rest of society, particularly the younger generation, are the same in Australia as they are in America. And the trends in which direction things are changing is also the same or similar. And the things that religious leaders do or say, or political leaders or judicial leaders who are influenced by a particular religious doctrine, the things that they have to say and do can have the effect of alienating people more and more and causing people to become enraged with those institutions and with the belief systems which are used to justify those institutions. And the long-term result of that is not to keep society frozen in a particular time or to take it back 50 years, but it is only to cause an even stronger reaction against those forces who only represent a minority view, even among Christians, and only speeds up the rate at which they become irrelevant as more and more people are driven away from them. Another major issue which has caused disillusionment with the mainstream churches is many of the revelations that have come to light about the way that religious leaders in positions of authority who had children in their care have done terrible things to those children. And I won't say any more about that, but you know what I'm talking about. That has been incredibly damaging to the credibility of religious institutions here in Australia, as well as elsewhere in the world. And when it comes to these social, political issues where people associate Christianity with a particular political position on given social issues, I realise that that is not reflective of all Christians. I have met Christians who were members of the Uniting Church, who were Quakers, who were very much passionate about social justice and considered themselves progressive, and they had a reading of their faith which compelled them towards trying to make society more open and tolerant and inclusive than it was before. And I acknowledge that, and there are many Christians who are being unfairly tarred with the same brush as more conservative Christians who are responsible for for inflaming many of the cultural war issues that we see coming up in the media time and time again, and who are seen as largely responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade in the US. So Christians are not a homogenous group. No group of people is. Having said that, it's very easy to see how a large group of people would come to identify very conservative or right-wing or intolerant positions on questions of gender or on questions of women's rights or women's bodily autonomy with Christianity as a whole. The reasons why it would be easy for them to make that association is, number one, because the most outspoken church leaders are often the ones who have this conservative bent. And related to that, many of these really conservative or right-wing Christian leaders are the ones with all of the money. They're the ones with all the power and influence. So their voice is amplified even more because of that. Even though their political positions are much more extreme than the majority of everyday Christians. And the other reason, of course, and this is a bit of an uncomfortable truth, is that there are certain verses in the Bible which would seem to reinforce or vindicate the view of the fundamentalists. A few Bible verses that come to mind when it comes to women's rights are 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 1 Peter chapter 3. Similarly, Leviticus chapters 18 and 20 when it comes to debates around LGBTQIA plus issues. There have been some contemporary interpretations of those particular scriptural references that are not quite as, shall we say, narrow-minded in terms of what is possible within the gender spectrum and the spectrum of people's orientation. But that's quite recent, and since the days of Constantine onwards, so really the days since the definitions of what is a Christian really began to solidify, there's been quite a bit of agreement on what those verses are referring to. And that cannot be denied. It just cannot be denied. And yes, there are Christians who say, well, the Bible helps us to understand the mystery of God, but we acknowledge that it is just human beings writing the words down and trying to grapple with the divine mystery in an imperfect way. But again, that's a modern innovation. Traditionally, if you're a Christian, you are supposed to believe that everything that is in the Bible is the inerrant word of God, and you're not supposed to change it, you're not supposed to twist its interpretation, you're supposed to take it as it is. And so, bearing all of that in mind, the argument that there is a scriptural basis that is fundamental to Christian belief, which explains how some of these attitudes came about, is a very persuasive argument. And in a society where people are increasingly changing their attitudes about how women are treated in a society and how people who don't fit within heteronormative categories are treated, that way of thinking is very outdated and something that is increasingly being abandoned. And so for all of those reasons, whether accurate or not, Christianity has become associated with social trends which are increasingly seen as incompatible with a modern, open, tolerant society. And because of that, and because of the way that people in positions of authority who are representing the church have treated people when they were younger, more and more people are turning their backs on Christianity. And the cumulative effect of that over many decades is that now Australia is no longer a Christian nation. We no longer have a majority Christian population, and in the years to come, Christians won't even be the biggest religious group anymore. And in the US, where modern history has often borne great similarities to what happens in Australia and the cultural trends that occur, the current justices of the Supreme Court may come to their age of retirement or towards the end of their life and find that the society that they are surrounded by is very different to the one that they remember today and the one which the majority of them tried to create. And they may well find that their actions over the past week have contributed to an ever-increasing corrosion of the religious identity that the United States once took for granted. And there will be consequences for that. So, that was my video on the results of the Australian census. Very interesting times indeed. So I'd be interested to know what you think about this issue. Leave your comments down below. If you like what I'm doing on this channel, please subscribe to support my work. It really does help me. Other than that, thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.